just assumed early in my identity career, well, everybody needs identity and access management. But really, unless you're a big enterprise, what people were really doing, what IT was doing, was what I would call application by application user management and doing it kind of onesie twosie. And there's a lot of insecurity in that.
Welcome to the Phillip Wylie Show. Take a look behind the curtain of professional hacking and hear compelling discussions with guests from diverse backgrounds who share a common curiosity and passion for challenges and their job. And now, here's your host, offensive security professional, educator, mentor, and author, Phillip Wylie.
Hello, welcome to another episode of the Phillip Wylie Show. Today I'm joined by Eve Mailer. She's got a book out on identity security, which we're going to discuss in the podcast, but she was recommended by a good friend of mine. And as I was telling Eve before we started the podcast, she's one of my first guests I had as a recommendation from someone outside of the tech space. So this should be interesting. Usually those type of stories, when you get to meet folks that you really haven't had much discussions with, and you get to talk to them first time, can be really interesting because there's things that you're learning new about them along the way. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great to have you on and great to finally get to meet. I know we'd planned lunch at one point, but we weren't able to meet up, but it's good to be able to meet you virtually.
Yeah, it's nice to meet local security people. There's a great community in the Dallas area.
Yeah, I agree. We're very fortunate because I can't think of many areas that really have a bigger cybersecurity community because we have the North Texas ISSA, an ISCT chapter, WOSEC, WESIS. I think there's even a women's cyber jitsu chapter, WOSEC. There's also two DEF CON groups, Dallas Hackers Association, a 2600 group. So it's just amazing how big the community is here.
Yeah. And I think community is so important to security because if we're not sharing information, the bad guys are sharing information. So we better get on with it.
Yeah, I totally agree because there's so much you can learn if you work for a smaller company. Sometimes you don't get the experiences of someone with a bigger company. Then at the same time too, if you work for a bigger company, you're really siloed. There's some things you may miss out on, and you may work places you're always not getting to work with those really super smart folks that you may run into other places. So it's always great to be able to network with folks.
Absolutely.
Another important thing about community too is you're hearing a lot of these longevity experts talking about community being very important. And that's one of the things that's really probably helped me grow community wise a lot more, is just something I'm interested in. I've been part of the fitness and powerlifting community before, but none of the communities were really stuck with me or I really enjoyed as much as I have the cybersecurity community.
No, that's another thing we'll have to talk about in the long run because I do a lot of longevity work and that's very important to me. So we have a lot in common.
Yeah, that's very cool. Yeah, it's one of the things I've been into, health and from powerlifting and just getting into lifting weights and stuff when I was younger. One of my very first books when I was 15 was like a nutrition almanac. So that's kind of one of my first exposures to nutrition. And so, yeah, that would be an interesting discussion for a later day.
Sounds great.
So before we get too far into the conversation, why don't you share your hacker origin story, kind of how you started up into what you're doing today?
Yeah, so, definitely out of left field. I studied linguistics at university and not like computational linguistics and not studying ancient languages, but rather trying to suss out the structures of natural language and devise the rules to describe that grammar. And I didn't know what I was going to do for a living. And I landed at Digital Equipment Corporation as a technical editor, actually editing software documentation. So, people who like to throw tomatoes at, people in tech that they hate, probably documentation of all those old systems come to mind. But I started working with tagging data to make it accessible to systems. And I got in on the early SGML wave. Now, that wasn't a very big wave, and people may not know what SGML is, but standard generalized markup language, which is all about designing your own tagging languages for semi-structured data, like narrative data, for example. SGML was the predecessor to XML, which people may definitely know about. That's the angle bracket stuff. And, it's the basis for a whole bunch of standard languages that give us interoperability between systems. And so I knew about SGML very well. 30 years ago, I wrote a book about SGML schemas called Document Type Definitions. And I helped create XML, which we created by taking all the parts of SGML that didn't want to survive the web era and carving them away to get XML. So my introduction to identity specifically was around how do we standardize some XML languages around making single sign-on happen cross-domain. So that's how I came to help create SAML, which some in your audience may know, security assertion markup language. And I came into that not as the security expert, not as the directory expert, but the XML person, basically. So that was in the year 2000, the end of the year 2000, when we started talking about starting that committee. And I ended up running that committee. I was the first chair of the group because I was perceived as the neutral party at the table of warring vendors. So that's how I got my start.
Very cool. So a lot of blasts from the past there, even the reference to working at Digital Equipment Corporation. For some folks that may not know, that's the company DEC. And if you ever hear the computers, the DEC Alpha chips, that's kind of, I started out as a system administrator before I got into security. So that was a very popular hardware back in the late 90s when I was getting started as a system administrator.
Yeah, definitely walk down memory lane. I was a big fan of DEC, ex-Decies, and I also worked at Sun Microsystems, and I think there's some commonalities between those experiences because they were wonderful companies that were built on doing the right thing. So I had a great time at both companies and felt very well supported in doing some of the innovation that I've contributed to.
Yeah, very cool. One of my former managers from Cognito, she used to work at Sun Microsystems. She was like on the marketing team for Java or something like that, and maybe for a while for Solaris. So it's pretty interesting to chat with folks that have worked for some of those companies that were so big back in the day. And it's just kind of sad that the world has become so dominant Windows that some of those other systems have gone away, like Sun Microsystems. We had a lot of Sun Solaris in the IT shops at some of the places I've worked before.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, they had a big footprint back in the day, and it was a wonderful time.
Yeah, I like the color of their equipment too because they had that purplish color on it, which was kind of nice.
PDP-11, the PDP stood for pink and dark purple because that's what the toggle colors were.
Makes me think because there used to be, I think they're still around, but there was a company, Extreme Networks, and all their routers and switches were purple. And some of the network engineers I worked with referred to some of the equipment we had as the Barney boxes, because Barney the dinosaur is purple. So,
nice.
so very cool. So if you could kind of go over, since you've kind of been working around the identity space, how has that really evolved since you first got involved with identity?
Yeah, I mean, it's evolved a ton. The start of SAML it got its start because we had the web and we were struggling with some new concepts like web services. So instead of just having kind of web 1.0 people with eyeballs looking at computers, we had this effort to try and have the computers talk to each other. It's never the first question asked, but it was kind of the second question asked. Well, how do we secure those interactions? So SAML kind of came in as one of the first efforts to, we didn't call it identity anything. There's no I in security assertion markup language, but the idea was to package up information about who was approaching and what kind of authentication they'd performed at what time, send that to some system that could rely on it. So basically outsourcing authentication. That's what single sign-on does. So even though we didn't start talking about identity security as a phrase very much until maybe a couple of years ago, the world has sort of woken up to the fact that zero trust depends on identity and a whole bunch of security elements are very identity centric. We didn't talk in that language back then. So we were really trying to solve this challenge of who's approaching and what assurance do we have that they really are who they say they are. And that ended up unlocking a whole bunch of technologies, kind of a couple different technology stacks. There was kind of remember the WS Star technology stack, the standard stack, and SAML was an influencer on that and kind of a cousin to it. just for securing what amount to API calls. And there was a second stack that came along in like the 2010s, if that was sort of the 2000s. The 2010s started having the OAuth stack. And, on top of that, OpenID Connect. So all of these identity inflected standards for interoperability have been with us for quite some time and been deepened and broadened. And, now there's like 100 different little OAuth specs all surrounding how you do what amounts to API security. We now have a fairly sophisticated landscape of how to do that. And hopefully it's sophisticated enough to survive the AI agent era.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting to think back to some of the technologies around when that kind of got started, because remember back in the day before we had APIs, you had middleware servers, because I remember Microsoft came out with their BizWorks middleware servers, because, back in those days we had, your Sun Solaris systems, your different types of Unix and Linux and Windows and Novell NetWare trying to communicate. And that was really one of the times where I first started hearing more about XML, because XML became a very hot topic in IT because of the interconnectivity. So it's really interesting to see how things evolved. And you had in having directory services and stuff, because back then, you had Novell directory services, and then Microsoft has started their own directory services. And so it's kind of interesting to be able to wrangle all that.
Something that I mentioned in my book briefly, one of the things I don't describe at all in the book is the era of the business languages that were all XML based just prior to that kind of API era. So remembering SOA, service-oriented architecture, which somebody joked should be called document-oriented architecture, DOA. One of the things I had a little bit to do with was the EBXML set of standards, kind of another stack that predated a lot of the kind of modern web standards. And it was very heavy. It was all XML based. Something I worked on with a lot of colleagues was called UBL, which was Universal Business Language. So there was just a whole host of these things where people were trying to figure out interoperability, and all they could really reach for was XML, which, okay, I had a hand in creating it, but I'm willing to say, yeah, it's pretty heavy. And, we were starting to be laughed at by the JSON people at a certain point in time. So, there were things that we had to do to respond to the moment of, developers wanting these lightweight tools that would give them what they need. And we want to not put friction in their way, not stand in their way, but make things easy to absorb.
So kind of what are your views as far as how security's improved on that front with identity?
Yeah, it's for a long time, even if I sit on a plane next to somebody who's completely non-technical, they'd say, "What do you do?" And I'd be like, "Well, identity, like passwords." And then I'd sort of duck, waiting for them to throw things at me. I think we're actually making some progress on the authentication front, the strength of authentication, the ability to make it more deterministic as opposed to just guessing, and the ability to add context where heuristic methods of kind of continuous observation really help. So things like the advent of passkeys as a technology is actually bringing us forward. It may not be perfect, particularly for those of your audience who are aware of device-bound versus syncable passkeys, where you say you're putting your private key into iCloud. Is that safe? Well, it might be safer than the alternative of not being secured with something that's phishing resistant. So I'd say we've been making authentication able to have a higher quality than it ever has before, without having to compromise so much on, a poor user experience or on deployability. So authentication has come a long way, and now we see authorization and access control starting to get a little bit more sophisticated. So I feel like we are getting a few things right. We are improving a few things. There's still a lot of folks who are not applying all the lessons yet, and that's where we need to up the maturity in these organizations.
Yeah, that's great to hear the improvement, but it's just interesting too to see the different types of authentication mechanisms in place, because when I first moved into my first security role, I had to set up a system. It was an RSA product. I'm trying to think of the name of it now, but it was a way to be able to.
Was it the hard
Yeah,
token?
no, it wasn't Secure ID. We were actually using Secure ID, but this was a tool that we were using to be able to let people authenticate that were contractors are coming in from the internet to connect. And it was able to, we had like a different Active Directory in place for people to authenticate, and it kind of connected together I forget exactly what it is because they changed the name of it, but I had to get that set up to be able to do that communication between the different types of authentication. So it's just really kind of interesting to see how that's grown.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of innovation in that space. It's a very kind of messy space. Authentication innovation is it's always kind of bursting out in a lot of different places, people trying different things.
It's nice though that multi-factor is getting easier to manage because you remember back in the day when you had if something happened to your token, it got messed up, you had to call the help desk. Now there's ways you can go to a page,
Yes.
scan a QR code, add it to your authentication
Hmm.
tool of choice, app of choice. And I was because tell my wife that here recently because she got a new phone and was setting all that up with them. It is so much easier now to set up than what it used to be because
Yeah.
you were going to have to call IT to get it set up. You couldn't do it on your own.
And there's new risk in calling IT, what with, hackers that are easily social engineering who they're calling. There's account recovery is always a very fraught kind of process. One of the sets of research that I published when I was at Forrester Research was all about strong auth and particularly customer facing, or like you're saying, contractors, external facing strong auth, which is a little bit more difficult. Maybe they don't have a laptop with a certificate that, you gave them, things like that. And there's so many subtleties around how you optimize the experience. This is one of the tough parts about identity, really, because it's about protection, but it's simultaneously exposed to end users. You kind of can't get away from it. So the ability in the modern era to do things like device registration are huge for improving those kind of bridge times when you need to change devices, as I just did last week, actually, on my mobile devices. Felt the pain, but it was better than it's been prior.
It's it's really kind of interesting how, back in the day things weren't as complicated, but the tools we had were more difficult to use and trying to get things set up. Now it's easier, but then at the same time as ways things have gotten easier, it's amazing all the different identities that we have to be able to secure and set up compared to what there used to be.
Yes, I mean, there's always surveys that'll say, well, people have on average 20 or 80 or 100. I've had several hundred logins for many years. At some point, I decided to, sort of start counting them and eventually using a password manager. It's actually quite interesting how password managers have kind of not pivoted exactly, but broadened their remit so that they can account for things like passkeys, becoming passkey providers and passkey holders and things like that. So I think it's maybe unfortunate that the general population has to learn some of these words, these concepts, and the techniques, but they're getting more secure thereby. So it's
Yeah.
probably good.
Yeah. I think that's a good thing because you take folks that normally aren't using a password manager, maybe they get exposed to it at work. Maybe they're fortunate enough to work for one of those companies that will actually provide you with, a license for your personal use because, the more secure you are personally, the better off you are corporate wise because what insecure ways you're using and doing business, can replicate into the corporate world if you're not using those at home.
Absolutely. I mean, lateral movement across from personal to business things is a thing, right? So it's best to battle it from a kind of whole of life perspective.
So AI is all the buzz these days. So how is AI complicating things in the identity world?
Oh goodness. In large part, I mean, it's automating and scaling both good things and bad things. Some of the groups that I participate in, there's one called AI Identity Management at the OpenID Foundation, and they had a meeting just today talking about some newfangled things like transaction tokens. So we're used to, OAuth access tokens. There's a proposal for transaction tokens that carry context, and it can include things like context of an agent that has been delegated by a human to do something. What is the thing it's been delegated to do? Well, that's part of the context that you need to know if you're looking to achieve least privilege. So those are some of the things people are keeping their eyes on, and we're trying to have sort of one great solution, but I think there's too many possibly great solutions on the landscape right now.
At least it's good to see things seem to be improving.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. It's I don't want to ever just advise somebody, have faith, it's going to get better. But I think there is a little bit of evidence that in some ways we are we're beating back the bad actor hordes.
And just the whole administration around access because whenever I first started in security, we had a team of like 4 or 5 people that were setting up IDs, because at the time you didn't have the HR systems that someone would come in, sign up, it would enroll them. If
Mhm.
they left the company, then it would remove their access. It was all manual. So it's good to see that some of those things are being more automated.
For sure. I mean, one of the things that I just assumed early in my identity career, well, everybody needs identity and access management, but really, unless you're a big enterprise, what people were really doing, what IT was doing, was what I would call application by application user management, and doing it kind of onesie twosie. And there's a lot of insecurity in that. Although there's a little bit of sort of accidental security, because if somebody has a different password on all, let's say, 12 of the systems that they have to interact with at work, well, okay, so no chance for lateral movement there. But with single sign-on comes the need to have stronger authentication, because it's really dangerous if you're securing something with just a password and it turns out that somebody can compromise the password and get access to all 12 or all 500. I mean, there's some organizations that have 1,000 enterprise apps. So these are things that we've learned along the way.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting too, because some of the legacy stuff I remember back from then, we had some AS400s, and we were increasing the complexity and length of the passwords. And with like the AS400s, they did back then, they weren't supporting like special characters. So it made it really kind of difficult to manage that.
Yeah, I mean, the whole history of password requirements, so password policies where you can't use this character and that character, and it has to be this short, and it can't be a very long password. It's a good thing those are going away, and it's a good thing that, like, for example, NIST, which has this one special publication that every identitarian knows about, 800-63, which is about digital identity guidelines. They started in the first version of this spec saying, well, you've got to have this much entropy, you've got to, have people change their passwords often. And they've actually gone completely away from that, because it turned out it was all security theater. So just rotating passwords every, say, 90 days for the heck of it, turns out it's really not a good idea. So these are things we've learned over time. There's another thing that's gotten better.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your book. So if you wouldn't mind sharing the title of your book and what your book's all about.
Yeah, so it's called Mastering Digital Identity from Risk to Revenue. And people can learn more if they go to masteringdigitalidentity.com. And it takes the perspective that because identity touches so many systems, and because it touches every end user, it's kind of neither fish nor fowl. And sometimes it's found under security. It might be under the CISO. Quite often it's not under the CISO. It might be under the CIO. It might be under a product group. If it's customer facing, it might be in marketing. So yes, it's very important to security, but it's important to so many other things that it's really hard to satisfy that entire kind of list of things. So the hypothesis of the book is we need to treat identity as a product and not just kind of an IT afterthought. And I sort of break down, well, who cares? What are the jobs to be done of identity, including all of the protection ones, including security protection, privacy protection, financial fraud, things like that. And figuring out, well, who should really own it, and what should their remit be, and how can we empower them? So it's written for CEOs, in fact, who don't inherently care about identity, except that they too get annoyed at logging in and are worried about deep fakes and that sort of thing. So it's coming out in April, and I'd love for people to check it out and maybe share it with their favorite executive who probably needs to understand this stuff better.
So where will people be able to find your book?
It will be on Amazon in all the
Okay.
usual formats, hardcover, softcover, and Kindle.
Okay. Any audiobook coming out at some point?
I would love to record one. I would love to
Yeah, that would
record
be
one. I
awesome.
haven't I haven't had the time to consider it yet, but yeah, that would be really fun.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea, especially we were talking about podcasts earlier on commutes and stuff. People listen to podcasts. It'd be something good for people to listen to commuting or flying into places. So that would be
Absolutely. And I
awesome.
just love the experience, honestly. For a long time, I was a singer in a bunch of rock and roll bands, and I've never done spoken word stuff. Hopefully, that would be a pleasant experience
Yeah,
for
that really,
folks who don't like to
yeah,
read.
that would make it really cool for some, to have the book actually read by the person. Because I wrote a book and I don't know who the person they got to voice it, but that would be kind of cool for you to actually be the one reading the book.
That would be nice.
So yeah, so that's a much needed reference, and it's just really, like you said, geared towards CEOs with so many startups out there. It's much needed because one of the things I've kind of learned, working for a lot of startups is a lot of folks that get into that area, really don't have the technical background. Sometimes don't have the security backgrounds. They come up with an idea, but it's really good to have a reference that they can see how to securely set up their identity.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's hard to build in security first and also at the same time have a no compromises approach to experience and selling your product. And pretty much every company is kind of a technology company these days. So if you're interested to sell your digital products, all that needs to be secured as well.
Yeah, I tell you, if you're starting a company, that's a really good thing to have that thought out before you start, picking your technology stacks because, there's so many things to take in consideration when you're doing that that can make your life easier than having to go back later on and fix it.
Absolutely. Probably famous last words for some folks. There's going to be some technical debt out there. I actually heard a
Yeah.
great quote recently. I think it might have been a Gartner analyst who said that AI is the balloon payment on technical debt. And I really think that's true. It's like it's coming due, and all that stuff we put off, we're going to have to take care of now.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's pretty interesting. So, what really inspired you to write the book?
For some time, including back in my previous role, I was the CTO at ForgeRock, which was slash is a big identity platform provider. I was sharing with people this conundrum of, well, identity does so many things. Well, who owns it? And like, what are all the things you're trying to have it do? And I came up with this framework for describing all those jobs to be done, the 4 Ps: protection, personalization, payment, and people. And you're thinking about things that are risk facing, things that are market facing, things that are actually transaction facing when you've got value flowing, and then what people actually want out of, being in the connected world and not just what we impose upon them, like logins. So I was sharing that with a lot of our customers that were all enterprise customers, kind of global 5,000. And it was resonating because some of them were trying to solve problems like consent, collecting digital consent and then respecting that consent once collected so that it's a kind of access control, but it's user-centric. So, even 4 or 5 years ago, I was putting together this kind of framework for understanding, well, what are all the things we're trying to have it do? And therefore, who do you have to include in your circle if you're an identity leader to solve the problem? So, one of the things that's been proposed a couple of years ago was, well, we need a chief identity officer. I have to admit, the thought makes me a little bit tired. Like, it's already bad enough that CISOs often really aren't quite at the C-suite table, but that's just sort of asking for trouble. And I think we haven't had the clarity to understand where identity is coming from to even moot that topic. Like, yes, you want an identity leader, but do they have to be a chief? Like, I don't think the world's ready for that. So that's where I kind of got the idea. I was giving a few keynotes on this topic to identity audiences, going, I feel like I'm part of the problem. I'm waving around the problem, but I need to offer more of a solution. And so I had some thoughts that I had tested through my work with ForgeRock customers and developed them further in my current consulting practice. And that's what's in the book.
Very cool. Yeah, thinking of a chief identity officer is just interesting the way they keep proposing other types of C levels or whatever in the security space and technology space. It can be kind of confusing. Where do you place that? Are you going to place that under IT? Or are you going to place that under security? For me, I would think security, but some cases people don't always think that same way.
I mean, it's got to live somewhere. Like, having a full matrix kind of doesn't work, but just recognizing the fact that, like, if it does live under security, and it does at least half the time, even if it's consumer or customer IAM, not just workforce, there's still KPIs that are going to have to be looked after by somebody else, because you're not going to find kind of like an efficiency or a user experience kind of goal. A CISO is going to be awfully distracted if they're made responsible for that too, and it's not their area of expertise. So they need to go find the people who care about that, and then there's oftentimes answers for what flow to put onto a login journey, for example, where you really don't have to compromise. You actually make it easier, you make it more secure, you fight fraud, you can make it more private. It's possible to find those kind of sweet spots in the flows that make everybody happy. That's kind of my goal, is making everybody happy.
Very good. So we're getting down So we're getting down towards the end of this episode. Is there anything you'd like to share before we close it out?
I just want to say, I think employees are people too, and security people are people too. And I think it's good and right for us to not accept poor experiences when it comes to identity. It's bad enough out there. We feel like our personal information is all over the place. We feel like it's insecure. It's kind of a bad neighborhood out there. But identity can really be part of the solution. So thinking of it as a product with multiple customers is, I think, the way to success.
That's great advice. And your whole comments about a good user experience, the easier it is for people to use, the more likely they're going to use it correctly and not try to get around it.
Exactly right.
Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to join today. And in the show notes, we'll be putting a link to your LinkedIn account so people can connect with you, as well as the link for your book and all that information. So people are listening that didn't catch exactly the URL you listed, we'll be putting it in the show notes so they can easily find it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a real
Are you welcome?
pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. I look forward to some more conversations. Thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to the Phillip Wylie Show. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. In the meantime, to learn more about Phillip, go to thehackermaker.com and connect with him on LinkedIn and Twitter @Phillip Wylie. Until next time.